I believe we have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. And to start off with this one, if elected, would you support raising Arizona's minimum wage as has been done in some other states and cities? And if your answer is yes, how much? I believe we would start with Mr. Hess here.
Absolutely not. The minimum wage is always used as an excuse to underpay people. It's the joke on the public when they think that they're getting something for nothing. So I would absolutely get rid of the minimum wage and allow employers or force employers to determine how much a position was worth, and you'd find people's wages would go up substantially when the employers had to confront that rather than being able to rely upon the law being a minimum wage. And incidentally, I should mention, I would have vetoed SB 1070 so quickly it wouldn't even have been funny, for the same reasons that Jan Brewer was against it a week before she signed it, until the political wind said, I want to be governor. It's ridiculous.
Ms. Jones.
Minimum wage?
Minimum wage. We're still on minimum wage.
No, I'm not in favor of raising the minimum wage, and let me explain why. Because as an accountant, I've actually thought through a lot of this, and the problem with raising the minimum wage, although it sounds nice, and as a person who started out from very humble beginnings and occupied several of those minimum wage jobs myself, I understand the notion that it sounds interesting at the moment, but what it does is it requires all of the additional costs to the employers, who tend to be small businesses, to be pushed out to the customers, who tend to be the people who are working in those minimum wage jobs. So instead of raising your buying power, it actually decreases your buying power, and it makes the minimum wage worker and the job holder have less fiscal standing in the community, and I think that's exactly the opposite of where we need to go. I think what we should probably be focusing on is creating high wage, high capacity technology and other jobs, and then filtering people from an integrated approach to education into those jobs, so that the minimum wage jobs become what they are really, which is a gateway to a career and a lifelong pursuit of higher wage positions. So both as an accountant and a person who's run businesses and created lots of jobs in this state, I'm not in favor of that.
Mr. Riggs.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a small businessman, and no, I don't support an increase in Arizona's state minimum wage. As I think some of the other candidates have mentioned, we're in a very tepid recovery as a state. And actually imposing a minimum wage mandate on small business, which gives us most of our new job creation in the private sector, I think would be very ill-advised. But I do want to tell you, in the spirit of full disclosure, that in 1996, I was the principal Republican sponsor in Congress of the increase in the federal minimum wage, which had not been raised for many, many decades. And I did that very simply because I made a commitment to Bill Clinton, yes, president at the time, when we made bipartisan government, divided government work, that I would support the minimum wage increase provided he signed our legislation from House Republicans, fundamentally reforming welfare, effectively ending it as we knew it by imposing time limits and work requirements on welfare recipients. I thought that that was a good compromise. I certainly stand by that vote. We did fundamentally reform welfare, and we actually created an incentive for individuals, many of them single mothers struggling against heroic odds, but incentives for individuals to get off of welfare and move to work, to meaningful, gainful employment, and accept more personal responsibility and self-sufficiency.
Mr. Smith.
As a concept, I don't oppose a minimum wage, but so the question is, would I do it now? The answer is no. I noticed the president in his State of the Union spent a large amount of time talking about the minimum wage. And in a sense, this is the problem I have with it. In a time of recession, the minimum wage became the maximum wage, because that was what the discussion was, as if raising the minimum wage created somehow a boom to the economy or a boom to people. And I think it's fool's gold. It's a false notion that somehow the economy is suddenly going to respond to that. As a small business owner, I own several restaurants. I can tell you the last time there was a major increase in the minimum wage, I couldn't raise my prices. I still had to pay the same prices, and yet, in order for me to stay in business, I had to make the painful decision. As I raised minimum wages, I had to cut back on hours. I had to lay off people, and that to me was such a macabre result of something which was meant to try and lift people. Over time, I think it's good. The fact of the matter is that as we increase the economy, minimum wage sort of takes care of itself. Last I looked, they didn't have a problem with minimum wage in North Dakota. They were paying $15 and $2,000 signing bonus to work at a McDonald's. I know that's an extreme example, but in the overall sense, I think if we focus as a state, focus on creating the kind of environment where the entire economy can raise and can expand, the discussions about minimum wage become an afterthought rather than what is now almost a distraction and a small gain that we tend to celebrate as a large victory, which it is not.
Time's up. Mr. Thomas.
Yes, I don't support an increase in the minimum wage. The way to raise income and better the economy for everybody is to make sure that we continue to have a state that is an attractive place to work in, to live, to invest, to retire. And that is done through having common sense tax policies, a low regulatory environment compared to other states, particularly the other states we're competing with for jobs, for investment. We also need to recognize the fact that Arizona is it's one of the great unique places on earth. It's one of the great places on earth in which to live. That's why so many of us moved here, as I did 23 years ago, and we need to keep it that way. And that means making sure that we continue to have safe neighborhoods, that we have a beautiful state where people can come and enjoy partaking in our environment. But the reality is, the way you do that, it comes down to fundamentals, and these aren't as glamorous to talk about, but we do need to have low crime rates. We need to make sure that we're protecting the public, that people, when they go camping along the border or in rural areas, are safe. We need to make sure that people in the valley have low crime rates. I drove down crime rates when I was Maricopa County Attorney. We ended plea bargaining as we know it for serious violent criminals. Those had a good effect, and we can have that again if we have somebody who's tough and realizes, let's put first things first. Let's have safety here and order and good neighborhoods, and that will have a great economic benefit for all of us.
Mr. Bennett.
Well, Arizona voters passed the Arizona Minimum Wage Act in 2006, and so Arizona already adjusts the minimum wage in our state based on the formulas in that law. Obviously, when the voters pass something, we should respect and carry that out, but I would not support going beyond that. And I think we have to remind ourselves that in many respects, the minimum wage gives a false sense of security that we can just keep raising it and have no risk of losing the jobs that are below whatever that number is. And some equate it to a ladder. And if you cut off the lowest rung of a ladder and just say, well, everyone start at the second or the third rung, that's okay if you're already on the second or the third rung. But if you're on the ground level trying to get into the job force, you keep raising that lower rung, businesses, as have been mentioned, sometimes have to not hire people at a rate that they might otherwise do so. So I support complying with what the voters said to do in Arizona. Our minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum wage because of that act that the voters passed, but I would not support going beyond that.
Mr. Ducey.
I built a company. Now I want to shrink a government and grow a state's economy. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that if we raise the federal minimum wage, America will lose 500,000 jobs. I don't want to see us lose 500,000 jobs. I want to see us grow jobs and create an environment in which to grow jobs. So I'm opposed to it. And building Cold Stone Creamery, I believe minimum wage jobs is something that I know about. And I will tell you, in the years that we had rapid growth in developing that brand from 1996 to 2007, we had a tough time keeping a minimum wage employee. We had a booming economy in McDonald's and In-N-Out Burger and Taco Bell and Smash Burger, and all these new concepts were opening. Part of the reason we created the whole singing inside the store for tips was so that we could keep and retrain these great high school kids that we brought on. So immediately wages were rising. So let's have a booming economy. That's the best way to get people out of a minimum wage situation. And that goes to the components that I talked about, simpler and fairer tax code, lighter regulation, lower liability. My oldest son just started his first job at McDonald's. And he's learning some lessons there. And I suspect in this economy, although I think he's a good worker, and I think there's a lot of good workers around him, there's not a lot of people being moved up the economic chain or ladder of minimum wage. We've got to kickstart this economy.
Mr. Duvall.
Thank you. There are many component parts of growing an economy and growing businesses. We've lowered taxes in Arizona, making our businesses more competitive. We've talked about investing in workforce. But businesses also need consumers. They need people to buy their products. I note that two cities that happen to have the highest minimum wage in the United States, Seattle and San Francisco, have the highest rate of business growth and new jobs in the United States. The simple notion that business growth is entirely a function of the cost of labor is just simply too simplistic. It is much more nuanced than that. There are many, many factors. We need to grow wages in order to grow consumers who can buy products. Now, I agree with Ken's point. Arizona does already, the voters have taken minimum wage and indexed it to a formula that goes up. I support a federal minimum wage to 1010 because it will lift the entire country's purchasing power to create more consumers buying more products. Arizona families have been devastated by this recession. The gap between rich and poor in our state and in our country is at an all-time historical high. We've got to create a floor that enables families to put food on the table and a roof over their head without taking second and third jobs and never seeing their children. And that's what it's come to. And I think a federal approach is the right way to equalize lifting the floor.